Good morning. As you can see behind me, the attendees at the Water Environment Federation Technical Exposition and Conference WEFTEC are returning to the Memorial Convention Center, where they've come for every 2 years for time immemorial, going back and forth between New Orleans and Chicago for the largest water conference in the world. And this year they're almost at full attendance at about 85%, about 18,000 people out of the typical 20,000 people that normally come here. And I wanted to share a few thoughts before we start, particularly reflecting on a workshop I attended yesterday, an incredible workshop on reimagining the water sector through equity and justice. It was organized jointly by two leaders of water equity practices at Victoria Johnson at HCR and Walt Walker from Greeley and Hansen, who last year had done separate workshops for 4 hours in Chicago, and this year were able to bring pool their resources together and put together this incredible workshop for a full day, talking about what's happening right now in water equity. And the reason I wanted to record this video here, and I've been thinking about what I saw yesterday all night, I wanted to do it here because this site, you can't see from the sun that we're right next to the river walk. Used to have a big red neon sign there, that this site here at the convention center, where we are going to have close to 20,000 of top water leaders anywhere, but particularly here in North America, gathering at this conference 17 years ago. This convention center provided shelter to 25,000 residents of New Orleans, people whose homes had been completely wiped out by the storm surge that followed Hurricane Katrina. People who lived in areas that were not protected from flooding and that were subject to flooding because of decades of historic redlining, deliberate decisions to have blacks moved into those areas of the city. And so many of the people who were sleeping on the floors that we are going to be walking on this week were black faces. And that's important for us to think about as water leaders. We had an incredible program yesterday where we got to hear from Letitia Carpenter, who is heading up the water equity issues and environmental justice issues for the U.S. Water Alliance, where she went over some of the work that they've done, including closing the water access gap in the United States report, which showed through the data unequivocally that the top factor impacting lack of access to water, lack of access to sanitation, has been race. Race and poverty determine who gets water services and who doesn't, who gets protection from floods and who doesn't, who gets protection from fire and who doesn't. We've seen that who gets access to clean, safe drinking water and sanitation services, and the impacts on health, and what that meant, looking at what happened during COVID, that all of those other factors were part of the reason why so many more black and brown people were having higher cases of COVID, were having higher cases of hospitalizations, were having higher cases of death, with health that had already been stressed by a lot of these factors. And that we as water leaders have an opportunity to offset what has happened in the history and of our country. And we saw Letitia presented some information on as our utilities are typically part of governments that very deliberately separated neighborhoods by race. We heard from, and by the way, I want to point out that I was at the presentation on Capitol Hill on the results of this report, and some very powerful presentations that hardly anyone heard because they were held World Plumbing Day, which was on March 11th, 2020, as you may recall. That's 4 days before the shutdown began, the lockdown began for the COVID pandemic. So a lot of people didn't hear the very powerful stories that were shared there. I've got a very poor quality recording that I just had to make sure my quotes were right. These are stories that need to be captured. These are stories that need to be shared and need to be taken into consideration as we decide what to do with the $1 trillion in new infrastructure funding that is coming into communities throughout the country, the $55 billion in new money for water and wastewater and stormwater, floods, all of these, our water utility systems that are represented in this conference. It's coming up this week. So we had a very powerful presentation by a woman by the name of Colette Puisson-Battle. Remember that name. This is actually the second time I've had a chance to see her this year. She also spoke at River Rally in Washington, D.C. earlier this year, which is also an organization that tends to be mostly white, as is the water utility community. It took a long time to recognize that protecting our rivers is not just for people in high-end neighborhoods and rural areas. It's also a concern in the cities and also affects black and brown people and is very much tied in with environmental health and environmental justice. Colette is a former recovering lawyer turned environmental activist after Hurricane Katrina here in Washington, in New Orleans, where it was very clear how the impacts were so much greater on black communities, and that in working to support, that the data shows that if you are black, if you are female, if you are from the South, your life expectancy is much lower. And that the work that we do as public servants, we have an opportunity to really make a difference in the decisions that we make and support in what projects are put together with this new infrastructure funding. And by the way, if you ever get a chance to see Colette, she is an incredible speaker, very calm and loving and quiet, and just draws you in. Very heart-based leader. Do not miss an opportunity to hear from Colette. As Keisha Powell from DC Water, who also spoke, shared, she didn't miss church. Colette took us to church and reminded us, as did several of the other speakers, how important it is that we have these conversations about the history of water equity and the opportunities to offset that history of water equity and water injustices in the past, water inequities in the past, that we have an opportunity to offset that history with grace. And recognizing this is not about blame. This is not about correcting people for saying the wrong thing or using the wrong word. Yet there are a lot of people who work in this industry, these people who are walking into this building, regardless of what color they are, whatever race they identify with, that this is something that affects all of us as part of the human race. In fact, Colette reminded us that race is, physiologically, it doesn't exist. It is a social construct, and that at various points in history, there are people who have been defined as a different race as a matter of power, as a matter of deciding who's in charge and who isn't, whether that was Jewish race, Italian race, Irish race, and of course blacks and Hispanics and Arabs, Indian subcontinent. We have so many historical instances of people being treated differently under the law, and in terms of what services they are provided with, on the basis of this artificial construct of race. And so there is obviously an enormous amount of money coming into the water sector. There's also the EJ40, the Environmental Justice 40, which is about, this is an executive order. It didn't come through Congress. This was an executive order that, as the agencies implement the bipartisan infrastructure law or the bill, the IIJA, the infrastructure funding, and ARPA, the additional funding that's come in to the water space, that 40% of that money is supposed to go to underserved communities, historically underserved communities, and to address some of the issues of who gets water, who gets sanitation, who gets flood control, who gets protection from hurricanes, who is being impacted the most by climate change because of a history of lack of investment in the right infrastructure and the new technologies that are available. So as we, as water professionals, have this opportunity to to introduce not just what gadgets and widgets and other technologies that we're providing, but also how the projects that we're designing and building with this new infrastructure money can be part of addressing past wrongs and really be those anchor institutions. We heard from several current and former heads of some of the utilities that have faced some of the greatest racial inequities in this country. We heard from Tony Parrott and Sharice. I'm going to forget. I'm sorry. Sharice Warren, who heads up his contracting. They gave an incredible presentation on. This is really critical, by the way, on the role that we play in our communities as water leaders and who gets the contracts. And Tony, I first got to know him when he was one of the key authors, along with Harlan Kelly from San Francisco and George Hawkins in D.C. at the time, who really spearheaded the effort on the Water Works report, showing how important our water projects are to the economies of the communities that we serve. At the time he was in Cincinnati, he's now in Louisville, and he talked about how there are going to be times when we address these issues, they are not politically popular, and depending on who's in leadership in our communities, people may not want to talk about these issues. People may not want to address these issues. We don't see race, we don't see color, we don't see gender. We don't want to talk about this stuff. We're scientists, we're engineers, we work on data. Well, the data is very clear, and it's really a matter of leadership by people in the water profession to ensure that these issues are part of how we build our infrastructure as anchor institutions, recognizing that the decisions we make of where we build, how we build, that has a direct impact on the communities and of all the people within the communities that we serve. We heard from, I want to make sure I get all the names wrong, we heard from O.J. McCoy, who is head of Buffalo Sewer, where just recently there was a mass shooting at a mall by a white supremacist in a black neighborhood. When issues like the shooting in Buffalo, the killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, when that impacts the communities that are served by these water utilities, that is very much an issue for these public agencies. They are often some of the largest employers. The people are rocked by these incidents of racial hatred and injustice that in the communities, and so when these issues come up, that's something that water leaders often have to deal with. within their workforce and within the communities that they serve. And the trust that we build or do not build with our communities is very much tied in with some of the issues that have come up around the shootings, around some of the other issues that have come up in the country. We heard from Andy Kriken, who is now at Moonshot Missions, but was, what's on the other side? Was formerly at, there's a foot pedal thing. Sorry, somebody's trying to get into the trash. Sorry, I got a little throw there. Okay, so Andy was head of Camden Water, and often in communities like Camden, large cities that there's white flight and all the whites are out in the suburbs, and you have very poor black cities like Camden that often do not have the resources to handle some of the infrastructure challenges, and where it's very important to be able to demonstrate to the boards, which often are representing the surrounding communities, to recognize the economic and social benefit of installing systems that address historic wastewater issues, and how do we deal with having decision makers who are not from the areas that are seeing these impacts. And it really takes some skill to be able to present the data, present the financial benefit associated with these projects, and the differences in revenue structures. If the burden of new infrastructure is being felt by those at the downstream points, which are often black communities, whereas the benefit is for the upstream communities, which are often white communities. So, very powerful presentation by Andy Kriken. And then, of course, Keisha Powell, currently the Chief Operating Officer at DC Water. This woman has an incredible background of leadership at some of the communities that have faced some of the most challenging, some of the greatest challenges on these issues. She has been head of the water agencies in Baltimore, in Atlanta, and yes, in Jackson, where we are seeing a capital city in this country that has run out of water. Water for sanitation, water for fire protection, as well as water for drinking, and that she was able to share with us some of her experiences trying to address some of these issues early on, and in fact was called to testify in Congress after the crisis occurred this year in Jackson with the city running out of water. So these are critical issues for all of us, and as members of the human race and as leaders within our communities, whether we're working for utilities, whether we're working for public agencies, whether we are working for companies that provide the professional services, the equipment that serves the water and wastewater utilities, and many of the people who are going to be here in the expo center. Part of why they're here is to present and sell their equipment and services. But also remember that we are all part of this community. We all have an opportunity to say, we can take this project and we can put this here, and that's also going to, create more green space, create parks, community parks in areas that residents don't have parks. It can take areas that people who built houses, where housing was, where people were forced to live, basically, in very flood-prone areas, and turn those into river walks and places that can provide some green space, can provide some recreational areas, and at the same time ensure that we're not repeating some of the issues of the past of forcing people to live in areas that are flood-prone areas. We just saw the impacts of Hurricane Ian. Another reminder of which communities are more likely to be more vulnerable and less resilient. The infrastructure money that has come into this industry provides an opportunity to correct some of those issues from the past. That has nothing to do with placing blame or making people wrong today for things that happened in the past. It has an opportunity for us right now to decide how we want to spend this money, what projects we want to design, how we can integrate water equity into the construction, the new construction that is going to occur as a result of the $55 billion that is coming into water and wastewater utilities, stormwater utilities. We're going to hear later this week from EPA on the past, present, and future of the Clean Water Act as we get ready for the 50th anniversary. And I want to end with some of the obviously a lot of the discussion was very sensitive. By the way, I don't know if I remember to mention, wanted to point this out, that when Tony and Sharice talked about what they've been doing in Louisville, amazing program. Sharice has been head of their community outreach and contracting efforts for over 20 years, and this is so critical that when the money is distributed, that we bear in mind ensuring that this public money is distributed in a way that reflects the communities that we serve. And very often, smaller companies, startups are led by blacks and Hispanics and women, not necessarily because they wanted to be solopreneurs, but in many cases they couldn't practice their profession within larger organizations, or were not having some of the same opportunities, or just wanted to make sure that they were serving their communities, their neighborhoods within communities. And so there are many instances where even in the communities that have been most vocal about wanting to support equity, when they run the numbers of where their money is going, a huge percentage is still going to white-led firms, and mostly white firms and vendors and whatnot. And so there are some very creative programs that have been developed to help ensure that local vendors, that Black, Hispanic, and women-owned companies are getting some of this massive amount of new money that is coming in. That is very important to revitalizing the economies in these areas as we were facing recession. These are important issues to think about. So, again, incredible presentations. Thank you so much, Victoria and Walt, for putting this together. Thank you, WEFTEC, for offering this. There was some discussion about, how do we ensure that these sorts of conversations, this was an additional $250 or something to be able to attend this, and I want to thank Victoria and HDR for your sponsorship of my attendance at that event. People are starting to get noisy here. So I just want to say that that we have some really important decisions to make on what we do with the money that is coming in. Thank you again to Victoria and Walt. And as far as whether there are opportunities for to bring these conversations to the main stage of WEFTEC in 2023, when we will be back in Chicago. New Orleans is such an amazing city to talk about some of these issues because the impact is so present constantly from historic hurricanes. And yet, Chicago, where we're going to be next year, certainly is no stranger to race issues. We have people like Kim Duplaix from the Board of Commissioners. And oh, by the way, Michelle Obama's father worked for a water purification plant. She knows these issues. And if putting Michelle Obama on the stage is what it takes to have these conversations move to the main stage, could be something to think about. Anyway, I'm Dr. Kat Schreier. Just a few thoughts from yesterday's workshop. I'm going to go ahead and get in there. We're getting ready for the opening session. If you see me and you have something to share, remember Water Citizen and the Water Show. We are about the human side of water. So we don't want to talk, we're not an afraid publication. We're not going to cover stories just on, why you've got the best, widget or gadget or whatever it is. But why it matters. Why it matters for the water workforce, why it matters to our political leaders, our boards, local community leaders, Congress, why it matters to the communities that we serve, for all aspects of our human race. If you have something to share, please come find me this week at the Water Show. We'll be posting all of our videos at watercitizen.org/thewatershow/WEFTEC22. It might take me a little while to get the videos up there, as well as some of the additional materials that we'll put in the comments below. And it is really a privilege to be back here as we emerge from COVID, covering this conference. I'm Dr. Kat Schreier at Water Citizen and the Water Show, and I will see you online and at WEFTEC.